the classic feminist line from the second wave is rape is about power, not about sex. The idea being it's not about sexual desire, it's about politics, really. I don't think that's true. There are some cases where I think that's probably true. You know, if you look in the workplace, for instance, you never see junior men sexually harassing senior women. The sexual harassment always goes in one direction. So I think that in cases like that, you can see that there is clearly power at play, in that power offers opportunities for harassment. But I don't think in general that is true, or not the whole story. One of the very good pieces of evidence for that is that the age of victimization for girls tracks pretty much perfectly the age of peak sexual desirability, and the age of perpetration for men and boys tracks pretty much exactly the peak of sex drive. And if you think in those terms, then my argument is that we need to be thinking quite differently about what the solutions are to sexual violence, because the interventions that are generally proposed by feminists are all ideological. It's all to do with teaching boys in particular at younger and younger ages, teach them feminist politics essentially, and hope that this will prevent sexual violence. I don't think that it will.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my podcast. Today I'm speaking with Louise Perry. Louise is a writer, journalist and a campaigner based in London. In 2022, she co-founded a non-partisan feminist think tank called The Other Half, where she serves as research director. She's the author of the debut book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, A New Guide to Sex in the 21st Century, which was released in the US in August 2022. So we had a great talk. I really enjoyed talking to her, and I think that this is such an important topic, mostly about young people and the decisions that we're making post birth control pill in this time of understanding who we are now, and also groups, you know, schools where we have boys and girls together as opposed to girls and boys separately, and how that changes things. We talked about lots of things. I really hope that you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I really enjoyed it. Thanks very much. Hi, Louise.
Hi, Tammy. How are you?
I'm good. Nice to see you again.
And you.
So I read your book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. I read it. It was, I would say, an uncomfortable book, right? It was an uncomfortable book to read. So it must have been an uncomfortable book to write. Anyway, maybe you could just inform my viewers about why you wrote it, and kind of what your experience was going through it when you wrote it, and how it served you.
Why I wrote it, there wasn't a single moment of decision making. I sort of wish there was, because people often ask. I wish I had a Damascene moment that would make a good story, but no. I have spent all of my adult life really working in areas relating to this subject. I did anthropology and women's studies at university, and I worked at a rape crisis centre after leaving university, and since becoming a journalist, I've written around the subject of sex and men and women and relationships and crime and violence and all of the things that feed into the book. So it seemed in a way the natural thing to do to incorporate all of that, really 10 years of writing and thinking, into a single volume. I did think when writing it that part of my intention was to write the book that I wish that I had been able to read when I was 18 or so, because I didn't think that book existed. And I seem to have a very wide range of readers, from people that I hear from, every possible political and demographic background. But I must say I'm always particularly pleased when I hear from young women who say that the book has resonated with them, because they were the readers that I largely had in mind. How did I find writing it? I don't think anyone's actually asked me that before, because it is a really it is a grim book. There are particularly the middle chapters, and I wrote it largely while pregnant, or between about I signed the book deal when I was about 6 weeks pregnant, and then submitted the manuscript when my son was about 6 months old. So it was all...
That's very fitting. That sounds very fitting because of the subject matter that you were taking on motherhood, you know? That's kind of spiritual. That sounds spiritual to me.
My matrescence, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I must say that it's not an easy life trying to finish a book when you've got a little baby. So I wouldn't. It had a. I think it did throw the subject into sharp relief in a way that probably helped, but it was also difficult and stressful. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend anyone take on those two projects at the same time. I'll try and time my fertility in my next book a little bit more carefully next time. But yes, I mean, I think it probably enriched my thinking in the sense that there is something about having children that forces you to think about the future, and to very personally invest in the future. So possibly being pregnant and having my lovely son did encourage me to be, I don't want to say more optimistic, but more future orientated. I think.
Well, I wonder if it also made you more mindful of not having your son, of not being pregnant and following through with the pregnancy and having that child while you were writing this book, because that's the other side of the subject, is that we don't have a family and we don't have our kids, and what, you know, with the mistakes that we make and the choices, the unguided, misinformed choices that we all come into contact with, especially when we're very young, especially if we've left our community and then we're out on our own and don't have those solid, informed voices to bounce our ideas off of. You know, it's very tricky for young women to find their way. I know I was young once, and it was very tricky for me. I left home when I was 18. I said, goodbye, Mom and Dad. I'm out of here. I'm going to take on my life, you know, and then, you know, I did. I took on my life, and I bumped up against it a lot, and didn't have, and wouldn't, because of being proud, reach out my family, but they were like 3,000 miles away. So young women now today find themselves really on their own and making these decisions. And I imagine that's some of those people that you talked to in the Rape Crisis Center were women who had made decisions and gone places and not had that security that family or close friends or, you know, community can give you. So what was the population of people that you would see, and how old were they mostly when you were in the crisis center?
I did a few different roles over my period there. So answering the helpline and training volunteers to answer the helpline, which is the whole range of service users. And I went into schools to teach consent workshops, which is something I write about quite a lot in the book, my own sort of complicated feelings about consent workshops. Mm-hmm. And I also worked one-on-one with teenage girls. So, I mean...
One-on-one, how old were the girls, the teenage girls?
15 to 18.
15 to 18. Oh,
yeah. So I mean, most rape victims are in that age. I didn't know this before I started working there, and actually not really until later when I started looking into the numbers more on this. The modal rape victim is 15. They're a lot younger than people, I think, tend to assume, and the proportion of rape victims who are over the age of 30 is in the single digits, percentage-wise.
Right, so the kids that are 15 are sometimes still at home. So they still are in their communities. They still have their parents around. But, you know, as you said in your book, is rape a power or a sex-driven crime? boys that are, how old are the men, I wonder, that are doing the assault?
Also young, probably.
About
Also,
under 20?
Yes, I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, but yeah, definitely skewing in that direction. It's one of the pieces of evidence, I think, for rape being motivated by power, the classic feminist line from the second wave is rape is about power, not about sex. It's not, the idea being it's not about sexual desire, it's about politics, really. I don't think that's true. There are some cases where I think that's probably true. If you look in the workplace, for instance, you never see junior men sexually harassing senior women. The sexual harassment always goes in one direction. So I think that in cases like that, you can see that there is clearly power at play, in that power offers opportunities for harassment. But I don't think in general that is true, or not the whole story. One of the very good pieces of evidence for that is that the age of victimization for girls mostly and women, tracks pretty much perfectly the age of peak sexual desirability, and the age of perpetration for men and boys tracks pretty much exactly the peak of sex drive. I don't think you can really explain that through the power analysis. I think you have to be thinking about this as an aggressive expression of sexual desire. And if you think in those terms, then my argument is that we need to be thinking quite differently about what the solutions are to sexual violence. Because the interventions that are generally proposed by feminists are all ideological. It's all to do with teaching boys in particular at younger and younger ages, teach them feminist politics essentially, and hope that this will prevent sexual violence. I don't think that it will.
I met a woman, we've been on book tour for a long time, so I can never remember which city I was in most recently. But I met a woman who's in Berlin. That's where I met her, Berlin. And she's an outspoken woman doing her part to try to bring truth to journalism. She said that when her oldest was a daughter, so her oldest child was a girl, and so she took her for self-defense courses, and she took the self-defense course at the same time. And she said that it was a very powerful weekend for both herself and her daughter. And when she came out of there after the weekend, she felt a sense of owning her space, I guess you'd say, and not feeling vulnerable so much. And she said that she thought, or at least maybe this is what she was taught, was that part of the being the victim of a rape is partly due to a woman not being certain about the ownership of her space. So if she can be more self-assertive, then not as likely to be targeted. What do you think about that? Is that a good thing to say?
I believe that there is research that supports that thesis. I can't remember the details of it, but in terms of asking sex offenders to look at videos of women walking, and asking them which they would choose, essentially, if they were going to attack a woman. And they are more likely to choose women, apparently, who seem to be less physically assured. They're very good at smelling vulnerability, which isn't, of course, to say that, it's very difficult in this whole area to talk about the characteristics of victims and potential victims without being seen to victim blame.
Yeah, right.
I'm sensitive to that as a charge. I think that it is something that we have to consider. I also think, though, that it becomes very easy to shut down any conversation by accusing someone of victim blaming. And I think that actually that doesn't serve victims well at all, if it's impossible for us to talk honestly about the nature of this kind of crime. We don't apply that to any other type of crime. And if we can't possibly prevent something or I don't think we actually can prevent sexual violence. I don't think we can reduce sexual violence without understanding it. And to understand it, we have to tell the truth.
Exactly. Yeah. And we also have to help people to be able to listen, right? To be able to, it's just because you listen doesn't mean you agree. So you can listen, and then you can meditate on what you've listened to and see if it makes any sense, rather than also reacting very quickly and not taking the time to contemplate what it means in a deep way before you react, because you don't get new knowledge otherwise. It's very difficult to have something come in and make a difference in your life if you react to it quickly and don't even let it near you. Then it's hard to move forward. So I was curious, you wrote quite a bit about Marilyn Monroe in the beginning of the book, and that was interesting. And in it, I liked your book because there were many arguments that you put forward in it. I thought that was very smart, the way you put arguments forward in your book to say, this is how Marilyn Monroe was treated. This is how feminism has come into our society. Sexual disenchantment. You use all these terms that I'd like to go through. It's just sex. Like there were some different terms that you used. And through the book I was thinking, well, I don't agree with this and I don't agree with that. And then we come to the end of the book and you say, but of course all of that, although I've looked at it very specifically and in detail, it doesn't work. All those things, they just don't work. And I thought, oh, it was a good, I don't often read a book where it's so nicely laid out and then it's like, there's the gotcha at the end. That was good. I enjoyed that. And I was relieved. I was so relieved, to read the end of that book and to know what your conclusion was, which we can come to, in this conversation. And partly why I wanted to speak to you too is because of your conclusion. I thought, yeah, that's my conclusion too. And I think, well, I don't see any other way around this. Anyway, Marilyn Monroe, I was thinking about her and a young woman. And I was thinking she had her part in the decisions that she made. She wasn't a child, right? She was an adult. But it was definitely, I can remember when I was in university in my early years, if I went to a professor or a teaching assistant, I went to one and I wanted to work in the lab. It was a medical lab. And he asked me out, and so I didn't go work there. Yeah, and so like women, we aren't taught. I just didn't have enough. I didn't have to not work there. Right, but I did. I just avoided it. And I imagine with Marilyn Monroe, she was young enough that was a very different. There was a power differential there, like for sure. But yet, I do feel responsible for the decisions that I made back then, where I didn't take the position because there was, what was that? He asked me out, and I didn't want to go. So I avoided him rather than standing up. But, I didn't. I was on my own, living with a roommate in a city far, far from home. So I didn't really have anybody to chat with. I guess I could have called my mom. But back then, calling on the telephone was expensive. And so you didn't call very much. You wrote letters. Back when I went to university, you wrote letters. So then you're really on your own. Because there's no quick way to talk to somebody if you don't have a lot of money. So then so she would have been on her own, that's for sure, because she was even older than me. So she would be on her own. There would be no telephones really available unless she had money. And so her only guidance would be through letters and anyone that might have been around her. So she was in a difficult place, there's no doubt. But I still think that the decisions she made were her decisions. And you got to live by your decisions and just know that you had a part in it, even if it's a very small part. Her decision to take on that kind of work was a decision that she made. And it wasn't it was a very risky business getting involved like she did there. Anyway, what are your thoughts on Marilyn Monroe these days?
I think that we can often... so I write in the book a lot about consent and the consent framework, which is, I think, what we are basically left with when we do away with all of the old sexual norms, which are really Christian sexual norms, post-sexual revolution, when they've been thrown out the window in liberal society. The only thing that you end up left with is the consent framework, that if everyone consents and everyone is capable of consenting, then fine. I think that isn't sufficient, and I think that there are lots and lots of examples some of which I detail, where technically that consent bar has been reached in a legal sense, but actually the vast majority of us will feel intuitively that what happened was wrong, and that actually consent can't account for that feeling. One of the problems that we do get into, if the only thing that we have to rely on is consent, is that we say that up until the 16th birthday or the 18th birthday, whatever somewhat arbitrary legal limit has been imposed, which is obviously culturally and historically contingent, then children are completely incapable of consenting. And then at the stroke of midnight, suddenly you are completely in control of your decision making. You have perfect insight. You are able to make wise decisions, all of this. I think that's not true. I mean, it's partly because I think that youth is one of those, youth and adulthood and experience fade into one another and at different speeds. Unfortunately, we can't possibly accommodate that in law. We have to have the arbitrary consent line. But we know that in reality that's how it works, and that, say, a 20-year-old is an adult, but also often lacking in experience, often in need of guidance. I mean, I don't think any human being has perfect insight into their own emotional life or into what's good for them. And the problem with the hard liberal individualist stance is that you have to bestow people in that model with a really impossible degree of insight and self-mastery, which we just don't have. I think that in reality what we need, what the vast majority of us need at least, is some degree of template, some kind of social guardrails, some degree of intergenerational communication to communicate that experience, which you just can't possibly have if you're only 20. So yes, Marilyn Monroe was an adult in a legal sense, with the exception of some instances of domestic violence and sexual violence. The sexual exploitation that she experienced was legal, and she was capable of going along with it. She clearly had a lot of problems with mental illness, but she was sane enough to reach the legal threshold. But was it good? I don't think so.
Not a bit.
Yeah, and that's what's really difficult to accommodate within the kind of pared down moral framework that we have left to us.
Yeah, we can't. We used to have people, young women, were always with a family member.
Yeah. Until
they were married.
Yeah.
And then those kind of things were less likely to happen. But that was then, and this is now. And and like you said, the moral framework has disappeared. And
kin groups are very protective. And one theory which I think is probably has a lot of truth to it is that feminism, particularly in relation to fears of sexual violence and domestic violence, tends to arise in situations where kin groups are disintegrating. When you have, say, urbanisation, you have a lot of young women coming to the city and not having any protective group around them. I mean, one category of women who have always been painfully vulnerable to sexual violence in particular are servants. Thinking of, say, 19th century Britain, where you have a lot of internal migration, you have a lot of women, very young women and young men coming from rural areas into the city to work in service, within the homes of strangers. This is exactly the sort of situation where young women are acutely vulnerable. Because actually kin groups, yes, kin groups do perpetrate their own abuse sometimes. We can't idealise the family, the extended family. But also there's a level of loyalty there that is really, really hard to replicate otherwise. And that basic, if you mess with me, my brother, my cousin, my father, etc., you'll have them to answer for. If that's not available anymore, you can understand therefore why lots of women finding themselves in that situation, which of course university does as well. We deliberately displace young people from their kin groups, particularly when you have the residential university system as the norm, which isn't true in all countries but is true here and in many other places. When you are displacing women from those protective contexts, you can see why feminist politics would arise as a response to that increased feeling of vulnerability.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, the university, that's quite a place where both boys and girls are taken from their kin groups, and so that they don't have what would be an external monitoring of their behavior and bumping pads to bump up against. That's all gone all of a sudden. Yeah, and we never even thought of that, We never, through the 70s, when my sisters and I left home, my brother left home, we never thought of all those things. We just left. We didn't even feel vulnerable. We never even thought of those things. And we went from a really rural, the town I grew up in was 2,000 people, 400 miles from a large city, right? Really, really rural. And you were so excited to leave home because you'd never seen any of the world. So these kids, by 15, I was ready to leave home. I can see why 15 is really the time, girls have got their period, so they're women. By 15, pretty much all girls are women, right? And then, I've been thinking of status. So I have this theory, so let's see how this goes. So status in men is pretty easily defined, right, of economic status usually. So, and men, they fight for position and someone comes to the top, and it's decided among men. But what is the status among women? Where does that come from? And I always been thinking, where does that status come from? What do you think? I have a theory, but I want to hear yours.
So some of it is in association with men. It's from your mate or from your father, or whichever is your closest male kin. I think some of it also, in traditional societies at least, comes from motherhood and grandmotherhood. It is one of the payoffs in a traditional society. Yes, you have to do an extraordinary degree of work and self-sacrifice in your when you progress from maiden to mother, but the payoff at the end of it is you get to be matriarch, which is something that you do lose in a society which is less orientated around motherhood and children.
That's a good point.
What do you think? What do you think the female status
I'm
comes
thinking
from?
of young women, status of young women, and how you can maintain status or even increase your status, and how you can lose your status as a young woman. And I've been thinking, I don't know what you think about this, but when girls are young, when they're 13, 14, 15, and starting to become desirable, sexually desirable in the public place, as long as they're virgins, their status is maintained. But as soon as they lose their virginity, then they're out of that they're not in that status game anymore. Now they belong, in a way, to a different category, which is girlfriend. So she's taken what might have been her own independent status, and now it's in a way they're not married, but it's transferred to the person that she's involved with. And that can happen. Now it happens as soon as a woman loses her virginity, and that can happen. I don't know how young, young. And so from then on, if you stay a virgin, so I was just thinking about this in the last few weeks, you can maintain that status as long as you're a virgin until you're married. And that status is meaningful. It's meaningful. And something that we have almost lost sight of, how meaningful that status can be. What do you think of that?
The kind of homosocial status, in that you're, that you're assessed purely in terms of your position within the female hierarchy rather than secondhand from your menfolk. I think that's true. I think that a very, very strange feature of our sexual culture, which is probably sets us apart from any other sexual culture that I'm aware of, is that girls don't prize their own virginity in status terms. I think their parents do. I don't think, and other people, teachers, I don't think that adults are eager at all for, say, 13-year-old girls to be sexually active. I don't think that, I think actually parents and adults are generally appalled. But girls nowadays, if they're really in, one pushback I've had on this book is some people suggesting that what I'm describing here, the culture, the hookup culture and so on, is really confined to only a tiny number of progressive enclaves, a few universities or whatever. I don't think that's true. I think it is extremely widespread now, and actually the exceptions are a handful of generally religious communities that are unusually traditional. In pretty much everywhere else, adolescent and teenage girls now experience their virginity as a burden that is embarrassing and that they want to be rid of. And I don't think girls of any other generation felt that way. They clearly felt sexual desire. I think, the idea of girls and women being these completely sexless creatures is clearly false. But this eagerness to be participating in adult sexual relationships, particularly casual sexual relationships with no connection to marriage, no route towards marriage. I don't think that girls ever previously felt that. And I don't think it's as simple as there being... I don't want to use terms like false consciousness. I don't think this is to do with any sort of top-down conspiratorial ideology to keep women down. I quote my grandmother in the conclusion when I told my grandmother about my argument in the book, and she said, women have been conned. She said it very darkly. It's not quite, it's a good line. It's not quite true, because I don't think that anyone has done the conning. I think it's just that the pill has really, really upended our heterosexual relationships. And we now have slightly perverse incentives in place which encourage quite strange behaviour. But this kind of drive that young women feel now to be more masculine in their sexuality, against, I would argue, their deeper instincts, I think is very historically strange. And yes, I suppose offers what's difficult, I think, about it from the teenage girl's perspective, because these are girls who have really no experience of the world and are very easily misunderstand social signals and so on, and are extremely groupish. We know that teenage girls are always the first group to experience any kind of contagious mental illness, because they're very, very socially attuned, desperately concerned with social status, and therefore very impressionable among their peers. And so this is why you have things like, there's a long list of contagious mental illnesses among teenage girls: anorexia, gender dysphoria,
cutting,
Salem witch trials, whatever you want to mention. They have this really difficult balance where, on the one hand, being promiscuous is seen as a means of status, because it is a way of displaying the fact that you are attractive to men and that you are adult and sophisticated. So it has to some degree office status, but it's very, very fragile. I think there's a tightrope that has to be walked, where if you are too promiscuous, then you end up actually being rejected as a potential long-term partner by men. But if you're frigid, prudish, whatever, then you end up also being, also losing status. It's very, very, very difficult, and I think really, really difficult for girls to strike that balance. A very common experience for teenage girls nowadays, which I didn't experience because I was a little bit too old. I'm 30, so we didn't have smartphones until I was in my late teens. But for kids now who are getting smartphones when they're 10 or 11 or younger sometimes, sending nudes has become an incredibly difficult terrain to navigate, because what girls say is, on the one hand, they get a lot of pressure from boys. You know, they'll have a very attractive, high status boy who asks for nude, and that's it. Like, great, that's a route to status. That's a route to being liked, maybe becoming his girlfriend. All of this, but then always in the background is the risk that those photos will be shared through the school, and then her status drops catastrophically. So they're just the game that they are playing, without really understanding the rules, without really understanding how everyone else. The true feelings and motivations of everyone else involved, is so painful, so difficult for boys as well. But the level of risk to girls, I think, is different.
Now, what do you think? What do you think of schools that are same-sex schools rather than mixed schools? Do you think it makes any difference to the immediacy of the need for status and social, getting in with the social group and all of that, if they kept girls and boys separate? Because I think that that's really hard for kids to be together at that age, because there's so much sexual tension.
I think single-sex schools are really good. When I went to a single-sex school for most of my secondary schooling, and we chafed against it horribly. We were so appalled by the like restricted access we had to boys. And now I think, thank goodness, we didn't know how good we had it. I think it's a good thing, definitely.
Yeah, I do too. I didn't have that experience, but I worked as a massage therapist, and for a while I worked in a shop where they were selling cosmetics and giving facials and waxings, and I was the massage therapist there, and it was all women. And I really liked being there. I just liked being there. It was relaxed because it was just women, so everybody was relaxed. It was such a relaxing place. That's the only place I've ever been where there were only women. But I could see then just the advantages of that scenario, because as soon as there's a man, first of all, the man is going to act differently because he has to impress, and the women will all be in competition. And so, yeah, it sets up a terrible competition among women, very much more difficult for girls to make girlfriends when there's boys around. Because I bet you must have had, was your experience that you had a good group of girlfriends? Like a pretty stable group of girlfriends? Yeah, I bet. Yeah.
And that the agony and ecstasy of female friendships at that age as well.
Yeah.
Of passionate friendships and then passionate fallings out, and yeah, it's the nature of being a young woman. Yes, I mean, there are of course sort of distinctive pathologies as well that come out of female-only groups and of male-only groups, because you end up with this sort of magnification of the traits distinctive to each sex. I always think that the way people behave on Twitter is very much the way people behave in girls' schools.
Oh dear. A lot of backbiting. Of backbiting.
Yes, yeah. And I think it's because on Twitter you can't use physical violence. So that masculine means of conflict is foreclosed, which means that the only means of conflict you have available to you are the feminine means. So spreading rumours, casting people out of groups.
Yeah, absolutely. That's for sure what that is.
Yeah. So there are downsides to those homosocial groups, but I also think that they are very important, and I think that all cultures seem to have them in one fashion or another, which suggests that they serve some sort of important function socially and psychologically. And I think that applies to male-only groups as well, because I'm sure it does. The current debate over transgenderism and the protection of women-only spaces, the the common defence of women-only spaces, and it's a good one, I completely agree with it, say refuges or changing rooms and whatever, is that women need certain spaces where they are, say, in a state of undress, where they need to be protected from men because a certain portion of men will be sexually predatory or make them feel uncomfortable. And as you know, as soon as you kind of let that rule slip, then you will end up making those spaces unsafe for women and for girls. That's completely true. I completely agree with that. You can't apply that argument to male-only spaces. So if you're trying to defend male-only spaces on the basis of physical protection, you don't really have that available to you. But I think there is also an additional defence of single-sex spaces, which has more to do with people being, as you say, people not having to worry about impressing the other sex, all of the, joys but stresses of heterosexual encounters being put aside. And I think that men are just as entitled to that experience as are women. And I think it is sad that we don't really have those male-only spaces.
I wonder, my son was listening to a podcast. Barry Weiss had a podcast, and she was talking about cell phone use and how she quoted that if you are in a conversation with someone and there's a message that comes on your cell phone and you look at it, it takes 20 minutes for you to have full attention back to the conversation again. And I wonder if you have a same-sex scenario, say a boys' school, a boys' classroom, and have a girl come in the classroom, maybe just to deliver a message or something, right, to the teacher, and then walk out again, that it would take 20, I wonder if it would take 20 minutes to get that class back in control. I wouldn't be surprised. And the same thing for women, if a boy comes in the classroom too. And so
yes, I remember the feverish rumours that would go around if there was a boy in the school.
Right. I bet. Yeah. And so it really does take away our focus. And so those kids that are in these schools now that are mixed, and that's been going on for a very long time, it's no wonder their attention span is compromised, because there's all this sexual tension going on the whole time. I can remember in elementary school, it was even like that, where you had someone sitting behind you who kept poking you with a pencil or something, because they just can't help it. You just can't help it. And so it's complicated. We've complicated our lives by forcing girls and boys to be together all the time.
There's also that extent, coming back again to the disintegration of the extended family, one of the defences that's made of mixed-sex schools is that it's an important way of girls and boys getting to understand each other and of learning about each other. And I think, I'm not entirely convinced by that, but I can see that there's a role for that. But it's a role that would, if you have a sufficiently large and closely connected, like in geographical terms, extended family, you don't need that, because you'll be spending plenty of time with siblings and cousins and so on, who are related to you, which does defend against things like sexual tension, because you're not going to have sexual tension with your siblings. So you can experience socializing with the opposite sex without there being any element of sexual tension.
Yeah, absolutely. That's and also, isn't there, and maybe this was in your book, that a woman is less likely to be attacked if she has brothers in her life rather than a woman who has had no brothers in her life. So she just knows how to be around men.
And possibly also the intimidating power of brothers as well, too. Because most rape is acquaintance rape. That's the most common category of
how do you define
relationship.
Acquaintance rape?
Well, so, broadly. So that if we have sort of more specific definitions, then the most common perpetrator is a boyfriend or husband or ex-boyfriend. But if we add up, co-workers, friends of friends, people you meet at parties sort of thing, as that level of acquaintance is actually the most risky. It's not strangers, not complete strangers. The stranger in a dark alley kind of attack is unusual. It's
so
more
this
like,
is also then so it's a function something of the breakdown of communication in these new relationships that you have with people.
So I think some of it is definitely to do with an interesting bias that's found in men but not found in women, is that men are more likely to overestimate a woman's sexual interest in them than are women. And alcohol makes that worse.
Oh yeah, alcohol. Yeah. That's something we could talk about too.
Yeah.
Alcohol.
So I think definitely there is a real... sexual violence is infamously difficult to calculate in terms of crime levels because reporting is so low. But I would guess that probably the type of sexual violence that has gone down in recent decades is the stranger attack, because strangers tend to be caught quite easily through forensic evidence. And we now have much more sophisticated forensic science. Right. So generally, a rapist who would become a serial offender is caught before he has the opportunity. So I think that kind of offence has probably gone down quite a lot. The type of offence that I suspect has probably gone up, and there are other researchers who agree with me, is the sort of date rape, acquaintance rape kind of, where there is some pre-existing relationship but not a close one, and you often have alcohol involved and you often have drugs involved, and there's a degree of sort of ambiguity that shades from full enthusiastic consent to rape, and then there's quite a large grey space in between, which is of course what Me Too was all about. There were some Me Too incidents which were straightforwardly criminal, but a lot of what was described as somewhere in between. It was that subtle feelings of coercion or discomfort, and often women going along with sexual encounters that they didn't especially want to, but which they felt they were being polite, or there was misunderstandings based on alcohol, and just the expectation of... I think that one of the ways in which the pill changed sexual culture is that the previous assumption, at least for, respectable girls, scare quotes, but, women who are expected to protect their modesty, protect their virtue, etc. The assumption was that they would be saying no to any kind of sexual encounter outside of marriage. Whereas now with the pill, the assumption is that you will be saying yes, particularly say sex on a first date or whatever it is, that the boundaries have moved very rapidly, and young women find it hard to negotiate that to turn a yes into a no in a way that doesn't hurt anybody's feelings, that doesn't cause a confrontation, all of these things that agreeable young women don't want to do. So that negotiation is hard, and I think that's often what's producing these kind of grey area Me Too incidents, where you've got men who already are primed to overestimate a woman's interest in them. Alcohol makes them even more primed to do so, and then you've got women who are agreeable and are to some extent cowed by this expectation of being sexually open and adventurous and so on, and can't quite summon up the assertiveness to say no.
Yes, absolutely.
But feel really miserable later.
Yeah. No, that trouble with not being able to say no. I mean, how often do you hear in a marriage, a husband and a wife aren't getting along, and she says, well, he should have known what I wanted, without even saying. And so women have a hard time. They will stand up for their children, They will stand up for their mothers, and their friends. But to stand up for themselves, they don't recognize that as a meaningful endeavor, but, something that could change that would be a different definition of who I am, because I'm who I am today, but I'm also this person tomorrow and next year and in 10 years, and that I need to take care of that person, and that's another person. So maybe that would be helpful, because it's definitely hard for a girl to say what she needs in an assertive way. That's for some reason, well, it's secondary because for so many, forever, we've had children, and so that's where every motivation of ours has gone, was to this infant. And now, if that infant isn't there, now we have to change and learn a whole different way of supporting ourselves. It's and to be single and not married and have no children as a woman is a totally foreign. I know it's been around for our lifetime, but it's a completely foreign scenario. It's no wonder we're having trouble with it. It's no wonder.
Yeah.
And it's no wonder girls are having trouble. It's no wonder.
I think that our minds and our social systems just cannot keep pace with the degree of social change that we've experienced in our lifetimes.
Absolutely.
And because change just keeps accelerating. There are things that I have no real experience of that people even 10 years younger than me now, because of technology. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that we are really up to it as a species, negotiating that degree of change.
No, it's too fast, and it's going to get faster, which is hard to even conceive. And I know that, my grandparents thought that life moved too fast, but the rate of change now is, I don't even know how many times more. And
I mean, it was fast for your grandparents, my great grandparents as well, because 95% of our species history we were hunter-gatherers, and almost nothing changed. And then and then ever since, the rate of change has just accelerated.
Yeah, once the car and the airplane came in, man, it's just been constant. And exciting too, and full of opportunity and good in many ways, but the interpersonal relationships have suffered so much. We needed that. We need that, some constancy in our relationships to know what happened and to know what's next. We kind of have to have something like that so that you're not so much in chaos, because who knows what that does to our decision making. Makes it virtually impossible, I think, to make a good decision. So it's no wonder people are making decisions when finding themselves in vulnerable situations. Boys and girls, very, very tricky for the boys as well, because, well, first of all, feminism hasn't been kind to men, and so they don't feel that they're valued the way they were. There's so many troubles between boys and girls. It's no wonder that we've now decided we don't want to be boys and we don't want to be girls. We want to take each other. We think, oh, maybe it'd be better to be a girl than a boy. I have a friend whose daughter was, I think, 13 when she came home and told her mom she wanted to be known as a boy. And my friend was really good. She said, oh, let's spend some time together. And gave her, let her, listened a lot to her daughter, and also gave her some spiritual guidance, and moved her out of that school, moved to a different town. And now her daughter came home one day and said, oh, I'm so embarrassed that I was thinking that I needed to become a boy when really I was just an awkward 13-year-old, that changing my sex wasn't going to solve that problem. But at least her mom was able to talk to her, and now she's taking better care of herself, cutting her hair nicely, wearing more feminine clothes and stuff. So she averted that disaster. But many girls and boys aren't averting those disasters right now. And that is where a lot of my most my concern really lays right now, is with that, that group that you're talking about that suffers from rape, but they're now suffering from this gender dysphoria. And now, because our society is moving so quickly, we also have surgical interventions that never existed before. And those are just horrendous. Wow, it's horrendous. I can't.
Yes.
Well, I just can't. It bothers me so much. It's hard to. It's good to talk about it. We have to talk about it.
And I think people are as well. I think that there is certainly in the UK, it's a lot easier to talk about this than it used to be.
Oh,
and,
good.
I think that there is a growing recognition that this isn't right.
I think so too. I've seen something recently about people saying, we don't agree, and we need those voices saying we don't agree, because we don't agree. We don't agree. It's not good. It's not good for young people who are confused to be given certainty so quickly that making this drastic decision of their gender is going to solve their problems. Of course they're going to be confused. They're teenagers. But the answer lies in growing up. That's where the answer lies. Yeah.
Yeah.
How old are your kids?
I have one 18-month-old.
Oh, that's so lovely. I have 3 grandchildren, and one of them is only 6 months old. So she's just starting to chew on. She was chewing on a lamb bone last night. It could hold on to it, so she was pretty thrilled with that. She wasn't going to let that go. She thought that was a good thing. Yeah. They're so wonderful, those little creatures.
They are, and one of the things that is so delightful about little children is that they are constantly discovering new things that are completely new to them. And it means, I think, that you know this idea of the hedonic treadmill, when you achieve something or something good happens and you feel great about it for about 5 minutes, and then you instantly want the next thing, and you end up with this sort of perpetual cycle of dissatisfaction. I think that little children break one of the few things that break you out of the hedonic treadmill loop, because they are constantly offering new and beautiful forms of novelty. You never ever tire of the joy that they bring you.
I think they keep us young. I think the children, they keep us young, I mean, my kids, I can remember when they were teenagers and I was going to go into some ladies' shop and buy a sweater, and they said, "You can't go in there, Mom. Go to H&M. Don't go in that store." They were taking care of me, keeping me young.
I mean, the sleep deprivation ages you, I'm sure. Although you also, I assume there's a balancing act in your this degree of, your complexion aging with children, because you can't sleep, but you can't really drink alcohol either. So I think on balance, you end up probably looking a bit more fresher faced than you would otherwise.
Yeah, I know. I don't think we had a drink from the time we had children until the kids were at least 12 years old or something, it was,
because it's just, yes.
Why would you do that? Why would you do that? Because you're on call, right? You're just on call all the time. Even if you go out, you're on call when you come home again.
Yeah.
So, and I loved it too. Alcohol, our society is very strange about alcohol, that it's so accessible everywhere. It's so accessible everywhere. And yet, we have these problems with kids and rape, and knowing that alcohol has a lot to do with it. And how much is that in the conversation in any meaningful way? Because I don't see anything changing with alcohol.
I tell you, there's there's, I think, 2 sentences maybe in my book about alcohol, or 3 sentences or something. It's a very brief bit. But it ended up being a few sentences that were featured in widespread coverage when it first came out in the UK. And I went on breakfast TV to talk about my book, and it was this line about alcohol that ended up being the big source of discussion. And what I said was that I don't think it's a good idea for women to get drunk around men they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Not to drink necessarily. You know, 1 or 2 drinks is, you know, neither here nor there. It's the incapacitated level of drunk, which until recently was not considered a typical thing that women would do.
Right.
This, in the UK at least, this is a sort of 1990s thing, that women would go out and get really, really drunk, like falling over in the street level drunk. And I think it's this very obviously makes you much more vulnerable, because you have incapacitated yourself physically and psychologically, and you need to be protected in those moments, and you can't always rely on someone to protect you. And unfortunately, there are men out there who will take advantage of women in those circumstances. So this sort of, well, anyway, so this was drawn out, and I was harangued about this a little bit on the television, and the clip was shared, and the response I got from people who'd seen it and readers was overwhelmingly, of course, you're completely right. Everyone agrees on this. And it was one of those funny instances where apparently everyone is thinking the same thing, but no one's saying it. And then sometimes when you do say it, it's the floodgates. Suddenly everyone feels that they have permission to say it, which is, I think, I didn't realise I was doing that with this book, but clearly I have, because the response has been so... I get several emails a day from people who say that this has touched them really deeply in some way. So I guess that... When
did the book come out first?
It came out in June in the UK, and then it came out in September in the US.
Okay, yeah. Wow. So this has been must be quite a time.
A strange summer, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
What do you think about that, and how is it informing what you're going to do next?
Despite all of the sleep deprivation, I'm very, very glad to come home to a toddler who doesn't care at all about mummy's book. Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't know or care about any of that.
Right.
I think it's extremely grounding. I can completely see, having had a little taste of it, how destabilizing it can be to be the center of public conversation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I suppose you have to protect yourself against that in various ways.
Yeah, you do.
I am very glad, though, of course, that it's resonated with so many people.
Yeah, I think that's very cool. I like this. It's just sex. Summarizes the sexual enchantment idea perfectly. It's just sex. It's just sex. That girls think that it's just sex. Like, that's just not. That just can't be true. It just can't be true. If they thought about it, if they just discussed that with their mother once, they would realize that that's not true.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to know if you've never had a baby. Sorry.
Yes. I was going to say, as if it was like playing tennis or something. But we should know instinctively that that's not true. But I think that this technology shock of the pill, and other things too. It's not just the pill. I don't want to be completely technologically determinist about it, but the pill is clearly very important.
Oh God! But it's right. We've never had control of our. Are we men now? Maybe we're men now. I mean, it is a question. It is a question.
Are we different beings?
Yeah. We are. I would say we are.
Yeah.
And so that means that we have to be awake. In order to be a woman now, you got to be awake. Because you're making the decisions in your life. Your biology is no longer making your decisions. And it always has. Although your biology is still trying to make the decisions. That's why you're attracted to men.
Well, that's the problem. A point that was made to me by Chris Williamson when I went on his podcast a few months ago now, we were talking about this problem when you want to follow a particular social model, you want to do this aspirational high status thing, whatever it might be, having casual sex as a woman, say. The example he gave was a friend who was trying out polyamory, a male friend, and thought that this was, had sort of rationalised himself into thinking this was a great idea. And but the first night that his wife invited another man round to have sex within their house, he found himself on the floor of their bathroom vomiting.
Oh, dear.
Because his emotions were so intensely against doing this, and he couldn't actually suppress that actually our power over our bodies and our minds is a lot weaker than we think it is.
Yes, I agree, which is why we end up doing things that we don't understand often, because we aren't in control of who we are. We have to negotiate who we are, which is why we need to talk to someone. And it used to be that people went to church and they confessed their sins. But we can still confess our sins. We still have to confess our sins. And so I think that, that's a very good point. You can say you want to be who you want to be and what you want to do, but your biology will tell you. And it isn't socially constructed either.
No. There's social elaboration on these things, but you come up against the bedrock of biology pretty quickly, and it's not going anywhere.
Yeah, it's not going anywhere. So that's what we need to do, and we need to be realizing that the pill has changed us in such a dramatic way that we need to rethink what our values are and make a life plan in a conscious manner and reflect every evening about who we are and what we've done, to try to make good decisions every day, but also to have space for ourselves to have made mistakes, because we're going to make mistakes. So all these young people, we're going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. We've all made mistakes. And forgiveness is really important, because otherwise, how are you going to get up in the morning? So there has to be forgiveness. Or I would say sometimes you can't forgive because you've been raped. You can't forgive. Well, you can ask to become willing to forgive. That's a very small step in the right direction. I just want to put that out there for people. I think that it's something that can be helpful when something's happened. And it could have happened. I talked to a woman who was raped when she was 13, and now I don't know how old she is. Her daughter is 20. Yeah. Okay, so that's how old she is. And she brought up to me that she was raped. And I told her about this idea. I told her about a few ideas, but one of the things was this idea of asking to become willing to forgive. And to just, put that out there every day, to ask to become willing to forgive and see if it can grow inside you somehow. And then you can, be forgiving of yourself and be forgiving of other people. There's, it's total forgiveness, not just specific forgiveness, but general forgiveness. To practice that in our days and to hopefully bring that to the things that are most difficult to forgive. Anyway, I don't want to keep you any longer because I know you have a meeting. But I really enjoyed talking with you, and I know this is so important, this stuff. I'm so glad you wrote this book. Congratulations, by the way. It's a very important topic, and we need to talk about it lots, so good luck with it. And,
thank you so much.
Good luck with your baby and all of that. And I hope maybe next time we come to England, maybe we will see you again.
Yeah, please, that would be lovely.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Tammy.